Hello, my name is Howard Yoakum. There are numerous definitions concerning instructional design and how it works. Most agree in principle as well as respect to timeline. My personal definition is that instructional design is a systematic process of instruction that attempts to offer instruction by first understanding needs in respect to human performance and meeting the end goals and objectives of instruction, and then through design development, a methodology to offer instruction through a process of intervention that serves to make the transition between the learner and the end goals and objectives of the instruction more attainable. Definitions do little good, however, without understanding, especially in regard to education. To attempt to educate and or train an individual or group of individuals without a plan will often fail. Not just the learner, but the educator and the system that is charged with the responsibility of educating that learner, whether young, old, or in between. Such a plan has come to be known as instructional design. Those individuals responsible for the creation of a plan to educate or train first must realize, however, that human beings are different, as are the societies and cultures in which they live. Speech, dialect, customs, and understanding are all part of this diversity, characteristics that cannot be ignored if attempting to educate any or all of humanity. The plan to educate, whether in a formal setting or in respect to long-distance education, or in regard to a training program in industry or business, begins first with instructional design. Those individuals and or groups who plan on providing instructional design must formulate a plan that is appealing to the learner, thereby becoming a methodology of self-motivation, regardless of the disparity between the learners. Appeal alone, however, is not enough. The plan to instruct must also be efficient in providing instruction and gaining insight into the learner's skills and abilities, including their limitations. This is no easy task. However, if done correctly, the plan becomes effective in providing an instructional format to be used and revised as needed. Many think that instructional design begins with World War II, but I believe instructional design began much earlier and was a factor in the shaping of our lives today. The process has become more fluent and better controlled, of course, with the help of improved analysis techniques and faster turnaround periods when revision is needed. But to truly understand the implications of instructional design in today's world, and in what context the two words are used, we must first take a trip back in time and see why the two terms have become such an important part of the world's great societies, their educational systems, and their business communities, and of course the aspirations in respect to industrialization and military prowess. The most likely place to start, therefore, is in the Milky Way galaxy, our own solar system, and a small piece of dirt called Earth. Thank you. Early life began first with organic molecules, electrical charges, and a primordial soup that eventually led to more substantial life forms, including the dinosaur, who after millions of years had a very, very, very bad day. But it did give other life forms a chance to grow and flourish, including our predecessors, the monkey and the great ape. Through time, both the monkey and the ape have evolved. They've become criminals, businessmen, artists, and great scholars. Oh, wait a minute. No, that's wrong. Wrong reality. I'm sorry. Okay, here we go. Through time, monkey and ape have evolved, with Homo sapiens eventually swinging from the ape's evolutionary tree and becoming a force in the creation of their own environment, their own reality, and their own evolutionary track. Early man recognized that there were some in their ranks, however, that deserved to be in positions of power, usually the biggest, the strongest, or the swiftest. It was these individuals who became leaders in their respective clans. Other individuals, of course, were destined to become the workers and the artists and the educators, the innovators in their societies. These individuals created writing, art, language, and were largely responsible for the changes in man's evolutionary track from hunter-gatherer to farmer, herder, and a more cohesive society. As society and civilizations have evolved, so have communication skills in regard to language, writing, art forms, and culture, partly because of instruction, but invariably instructional design, although many times it was a consequence and not a science. Early Greek philosophers created much of our educational ideologies through great oratory and the written word. Early Greeks also created the first how-to instruction manuals and implemented their work into modular architectural designs that could be replicated, regardless of area. These designs include everything from the construction of the column to the building of great temples, even simple houses. An example can be found from the southern city of Potenza. There, archaeologists have discovered the remains of a 6th century temple with detailed instructions for assembly. It's kind of like the modern day assembly instructions found in the IKEA do-it-yourself furniture packs. Each piece of the building was inscribed with symbols showing how the individual pieces fit together. Surprisingly, in nearby towns, other city-states, structures were found that related directly to the pieces of the temple found there at Potenza, suggesting the builders had produced pre-molded pieces for other buildings as well, including many buildings built by other pre-Roman peoples. This can only lead one to believe that technology was exported by the Greeks at the time. It's simply amazing. Many cultures, other than Greek, have had an influence upon instructional design, and most in a similar manner as the Greek example, with the coded building blocks and written instruction manuals. We must remember, however, that whether a journey of 1,000 miles or 1,000 years, it all begins with a single step. Various religions during the time have had their points of view as well. The laws handed down from God. These laws have always represented a set of instructions and often have a set way of teaching those instructions contained within them. Religious educators through the centuries have provided the basis for much of what is considered vital to educating the individual. Even today, there was Peter Abelard, who lived in the 10th century and taught in a constructivist fashion. He believed the student must draw upon personal experience and prior knowledge for learning to occur. His teachings became known as the scholastic method and encouraged students to seek knowledge through a logical process of inquiry. This method was the forerunner of the scientific method espoused by Frederick Taylor early in the 20th century, which later became instructional design. There was also Peter Lombard, who taught during the same period of time, but in a slightly different context than his contemporary. He would give his students the answers first and then let them find the questions. Kind of reverse engineering. Sound familiar? Then there was St. Thomas Aquinas, who taught in the 13th century. He continued the work of his predecessors with just a slight change in instruction. Why, he used deductive reasoning. During this time period, the key ingredient for the student in respect to instruction, of course, was the textbook. This was an innovation that changed education at the time. Then education changed even more when the printing press came into being, and the textbook became commonplace, well, in respect to what had been available just a few years earlier. Then there was John Comenius, who taught in the 16th century. He was a proponent of organized education and state-constructed schools. He also believed that education should begin as a toddler and continue into and beyond adulthood, all the way to the grave. He had 7 basic principles which he followed, and which have relevance in today's educational environment as well. They are that the mind should be prepared to receive instruction, and that learning should begin with the general and then proceed to the specific. That learning should go from the easy to the difficult, and that learning's progress should not be rushed. The learner should not be taught in a fashion that is contrary to how they would normally learn, or that the learner should be taught through the senses, and that everything taught to the learner should be available for the learner to view at any time. Other educational idealists include John Pestalozzi, who taught in the 18th century and advocated verbal instruction coupled with experience. He believed everything to be learned could be learned through practice, repetition, and real activity. He would say the student should be an active, not a passive student. Pestalozzi was also an advocate of play. He believed the learner could learn just as much from play, if not more, than through needless exercise. During his years as an educator, he began research on his educational methodologies, and he also found ways to find funding for school systems from external sources. Then there was John Hebert. He taught in the late 18th and early 19th centuries and brought systematic instruction, utilizing views from psychology as their basis, into the instructional fold. His methodology included metaphysics, logic, and aesthetic values as coordinators of instruction, coupled, of course, with a philosophy of analysis of a learner and that learner's experience. Aber had 5 basic principles in respect to instruction. They were to prepare the learner to be ready for the lesson, to present the lesson, to associate the lesson with ideas that had been studied earlier, to use examples to illustrate the lesson's major points, and test learners to ensure they had learned the new lesson. Much of Aber's work could be seen in the work of Merrill today, and in his theory of first principles of instruction. Other influences upon instructional design include the military, business, and industry. Militaries worldwide have always, well, until recently, used a code of conduct that was taught and adhered to when engaging an enemy. This code was basically a set of instructions on how to fight and kill. It was used as a variety of methodologies for instruction and to assure transference of knowledge from teacher to learner. It wasn't really until later in man's history, recently, that science and various philosophic ideologies came into play, with military training expanding and then taking steps necessary to not just train a specific branch of the military as a group, but the individual within the military establishment, and thereby becoming a more volatile fighting force. The expansion of military training, especially in America, has engulfed private industry, business, and government training programs, with new methodologies and technologies that have quickly brought the United States to the forefront of many industrialized nations. As alluded to through the brief and somewhat spontaneous and incomplete history of instructional design, many of life's everyday events can be traced to previous times and earlier imagination. Today, the changes brought about by instructional design give every learner the chance of success in their academic endeavors, the chance of a higher return ratio for investment and employee training, with respect to business and industry, and a higher rate of satisfaction for those wishing to do better. When contemplating how I would use instructional design, I began to think of all the possibilities. Better societies could be engineered with more humanistic aspirations. Everyone could be an engineer, a pilot, or an astronaut. The only limitation would be physical, which hopefully would no longer be a limitation in a few short years. Also, methodologies could be formulated to provide instruction for distant space travelers, and even in the context of genetic engineering, starting life elsewhere. I can see where DNA could be programmed and sent to a distant star to crash, seeing a distant world, and eventually, through eons of programmed instruction, become us. I can also see where instructional design can be utilized in biomedical research to conquer disease by programming individual clusters of cells to fight as a single unit, or in encoding new information in our DNA to change our evolutionary path. Well, of course, these ideas are not really related to instruction and education per se, but again, instructional design is everywhere, and it always has been. Sometimes, well, sometimes we just need to look.